Good afternoon to many of you and good morning to some of you. My name is Amy Berman and I am the Deputy Director of the National Academy of Education. And I want to thank you on behalf of the Academy for taking time to join us today. I want to thank all of our panelists for all of their hard work in making this happen, the Spencer Foundation for funding this project, our dedicated steering committee, our incredible IT staff, and Stanton Wortham, our moderator. Before I turn this over, I just want to lay out a couple of ground rules. All of the attendees are muted by default. This forum is being recorded and will be available on our website after the event. If attendees have questions, and there will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentations, they can leave questions in the Q&A, or you can use your raise hand icon during the Q&A portion, and we will call on you. At this point, I'm turning it over to our moderator, Stanton Wortham, the Charles F. Donovan S.J. Dean of the Lynch School of Education at Boston College. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Happy to be here. I'd like to thank the National Academy, the President, Gloria Ladson-Billings, past President Mike Foyer, who's done a lot of the organization for these roundtables and webinars, and Amy and Diane, the staff, who are helping us pull this off. We'd like to welcome our four panelists. We're very pleased to have them with us today. We have Dr. Charles Granson, who's the Chief Equity and Strategy Officer in the Boston Public Schools, Pia Escudero, who is the Executive Director for the Los Angeles Unified School District Health and Human Services Team, Dorothy Espelage, the William Friday Distinguished Professor of Education at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and Frank Worrell, Professor and Faculty Director in the School of Education at the University of California, Berkeley. Both Dr. Espelage and Dr. Warrell are elected members of the National Academy of Education. So the goal for the roundtable today is to offer a set of challenges and solutions to maintaining student well-being given the coronavirus pandemic. There are three questions that we have asked each of the panelists to reflect on and speak to. First one has to do with what are the biggest challenges in addressing the effects of coronavirus on student well-being, with an emphasis on the most vulnerable populations. We all know that there have been many challenges raised by the virtual environment and the other issues that have been taking place out in the country with the coronavirus and quarantine and racial injustices and other challenges of the moment. So we want to engage the question of what are these challenges that school districts and educators are facing. The second question has to do with inequities. What inequities in whole person well-being have been exacerbated by the pandemic? Obviously, there were various inequities before this happened, and the pandemic is making some of them worse, which presents particularly acute challenges that we must attend to. And the last question has to do with strategies. How can schools, whether they're in person or online or hybrid, develop strategies for supporting and bolstering student well-being? So our panelists will speak to what are the challenges, what are the inequities that have been exacerbated, and what strategies might educators and administrators and policymakers use in order to address those challenges and provide useful strategies. I'll give a brief overview here of the substance of the topic of the roundtable and then the structure, and then we'll move through each of our panelists in turn. So as you all know, even before coronavirus, there was a growing realization that young people, students, have developmental needs that go beyond subject matter and vocational training. Everyone agrees that students need to learn subject matter and they need to develop skills so that they can pursue careers. But it's become increasingly clear that there are many other things that are going on. There's ethical development and challenges. There's character development that is required. There are emotional needs. There are relational needs. So there are many other things happening with young people that they bring with them into school and that schools are partly responsible for managing. That was clear before coronavirus. It also is becoming clear in recent years that we can't adopt an approach to well-being in schools that focuses only on discrete needs, that well-being is not something that can be chopped up into competencies and standards and substandards, that young people require comprehensive approaches to well-being simply because their emotional development, their ethical development, the relational development, and their intellectual development are all interconnected. These things go on at once. Literature, for example, raises ethical questions, requires intellectual engagement, creates emotional reactions. And all of those things happening simultaneously require a strategy for developing well-being that recognizes the interrelationships among these different dimensions of our young people and their development. Another realization before COVID was that barriers to student well-being are inequitably distributed, that some people are denied resources or face particular challenges or are systematically excluded in ways that cause them to have bigger hurdles in accomplishing well-being for students from those groups or in those settings. So approaches to well-being not only have to engage with a broader range of young people and who they are, but they also have to reflect on the fact that some people face greater hurdles. Some people are treated unfairly in well-being as in other domains, and schools need to address those inequities at the same time as they develop approaches to well-being. Before COVID, there are also many promising interventions that have been developed and are being rolled out. There's new standards for social and emotional learning in more than half of the states. The Center for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, the Learning Policy Institute, and other organizations have helped to build a case with policymakers and to roll out various sorts of standards, approaches, best practices. There's a very compelling report that came out just recently on whole learner education and the notion of integrating across these different dimensions from America Forward, which is a guideline for policymakers. There are integrated student support models like City Connects and other models which provide comprehensive services. These and other responses to the need for developing student well-being are promising, and they existed before COVID, but they're still not widespread enough. We need more attention to these issues. Into this environment where we're just starting to realize the extent of the needs for the development of well-being among young people in schools and out, comes a set of acute problems with the coronavirus. So coronavirus, of course, forced many students out of school, and many of them still cannot safely go back into school, and so will be learning remotely for part of the fall or all of it. There are challenges to health. There are, of course, people getting sick. It's a virus with various implications for students and their family members. There are also mental health challenges as young people face anxiety, stress, sometimes even trauma around the disruptions. There are economic disruptions with many people losing their jobs, young people's parents losing jobs and businesses and facing anxiety about economics. And at the same time as all of this has been caused by COVID, there's been increasing awareness of the need for racial justice with the murder of George Floyd and other incidents where a larger portion of the population has become aware of the inequities and the need urgently to address many of those. So that's a daunting set of problems that young people are living through at the same time that we're trying to educate them and support them in schools. It's led to increased social and emotional needs. Young people always have social emotional needs and needs for well-being, but they are increased by these various crises that are going on right now. And the crises that COVID has brought, as well as the crisis of racial justice, have a differential impact across social groups. So again, some kinds of students find themselves under more pressure in physical health, mental health, economic situations, and so forth. Schools used to provide emotional, social, nutritional, and other supports, relationships available to young people. If young people can't go into school, it's hard to understand how we can serve their well-being needs if we're not physically with them. Of course, increased anxiety among young people differentially across different kinds of people around COVID. And the adverse experiences that young people are having now cause difficulties, needs that schools should be able to address, but it's hard to know exactly how to engage such a daunting set of challenges that of course are affecting educators, staff members, teachers, administrators, ourselves. As we do our jobs, we have to worry about economic anxiety and getting sick and loved ones. And so we're dealing with these challenges ourselves, and we face the need to help young people deal with them in our schools. So in order to try to provide a set of research-based responses, strategies for trying to handle these many challenges that I have summarized briefly here, the National Academy convened a roundtable with a dozen practitioners and researchers to discuss what approaches, what are the challenges districts and educators are facing, what approaches do we know about that have worked in practice, and what research has been done to substantiate approaches as being good bets on ways that schools can try to address some of these issues. So today we have a subset of that panel. This webinar is for distinguished members of the earlier group who've agreed to share their time and their expertise with us around the questions of the roundtable on well-being. So we will have two presentations from experienced urban school district leaders. And then after that, we have presentations from two highly accomplished researchers. Each individual will take about 10 minutes in order to share his or her viewpoint and expertise with us. Practitioners will describe the challenges they're facing and the kinds of solutions they're implementing and what they're seeing that works. Researchers will share their expertise about different research approaches that have given us information about best bets and strategies for facilitating student well-being. After the four presentations, we'll have a few minutes for conversation among the panelists to engage with each other. And then at that point, we will open it up to questions from the audience. We ask you please to enter questions into the chat box. The staff will collate those, and then we will try to ask as many as we can. So with that introduction, I'd like to welcome all of you. Thank you for joining us. To thank the panelists, and our first speaker is Dr. Charles Granson from the Boston Public Schools.
Okay, thank you, Stanton, and thanks also for allowing me to be a part of the panel today, but also for your leadership locally in Boston and nationally around this important work. I look forward to sharing some thoughts about how in the Boston Public Schools we've been able to think about what we are and many are referring to as the twin pandemics of COVID-19 and systemic racism. Next slide. And so one of the things that happened earlier on in the spring is our mayor, Marty Walsh, issued an executive order declaring that racism, probably around June, declaring that racism was a public health emergency in our city. And I think that was, I think that really frames sort of this presentation as we think about how inequities in the COVID-19 context play out in a landscape that was already sort of colored by systemic racism. And given that that is pervasive throughout, how do we begin to peel back the layers of something that is 400 plus years in the making? And Boston, the city of Boston, right, is just about that old, and the state of Massachusetts as well, as old as the nation, in trying to better understand how we meet the needs of students, which seems like a tall order, all right? How do you get from 400 years systemic racism to meeting the need of an individual child? So hope to try to provide some insights into how we're thinking about that, again, in the COVID context, and meeting the best needs of students. We, as a school district, have adopted the saying this spring, this fall, of we need students and adults to Maslow before they bloom. And so typically we spend a lot of time focused on instruction and higher order thinking, and that is key to our strategy around providing high quality and equitable education. But taking a little bit of a step back from that to look at what students' needs might be even before that. And so our frame, I provided here our demographics in terms of our district, largely make up the majority African American and Latinx students make up the majority of our school district, and students of color overall, including our Asian population. And you know, that for us, when we talk about educational equity, really for us allows us to start with race, because we know that it's oftentimes the thing that we want to avoid as a society. And it allows us to start with sometimes can be the most intractable challenges, and that will give us insights into the other inequities. Next slide. And so when we look at equity and equitable access to high quality education in the Boston Public Schools, we also look at students whose first language is not English, English learners, our students with disabilities and students with special needs, high needs students overall, and then students who by our state have been designated as economically disadvantaged. And so we start with race, but we do not stop there. We look at these groups who have been historically marginalized, under-resourced as well. Next slide. And so our tool for doing that is our BPS Racial Equity Planning tool that has 6 components. And so this is a muscle we have since February, right before the pandemic hit, trained a bunch of our district leaders and our school leaders. A practice we've been using over the last 3 years, but really made a strong commitment under the leadership of our superintendent, Dr. Brenda Casalius, this year, to ensure that this was the way every district leader was engaging their work. And so it starts with looking at what the desired results and outcome. You'd be surprised at how many leaders often start initiatives, look to spend money, and have a policy changes that they want to make and propose to school committee without being really clear about desired results and outcomes. We must look at data, and it must be broken down by those various racial groups and student groups that I just shared. And then stakeholder engagement, right? We adopted the philosophy of nothing about us without us. And so we should engage students and families, teachers and school leaders in our planning and decision-making from the beginning. And then having very deliberate and specific strategies for racial equity as a part of that process, as we come up with an implementation plan and ensure that we hold ourselves accountable and we communicate appropriately. And then it's a cycle that goes back to the top to see how, you know, what we've learned about the strategies for racial equity, how that might go, and even revise some of the desired results and outcomes. Next slide. And so we have, we had Dr. Ibram Kendi and Dr. Katina Love start us out with our school leader professional learning about 2 weeks ago now. And one of the, you know, we know those of you who've read Dr. Kendi's work, we know that he's very specific around how we look at what we call racism versus anti-racist, racist versus anti-racist, and has a focus on policy, actions, and ideas. And then anti-racism is very specific to, you know, you're either actively against it and working against it, or you are upholding it. Next slide. And so for us, we're looking at across the 4 I's, and many organizations historically have looked at this in a number of different settings or iterations, I should say. But looking at systemic racism across the 4 I's, looking at the ideological, the interpersonal, the internalized, and institutional practices. And for us, a lot of that work, if we focus in on the interpersonal, internalized work, has to do with, you know, we're providing affinity groups for our staff, looking at moving that to school leaders, so central office staff, and so they're in race-alike affinity groups, working out some of the challenges that they might have in terms of how they were raised and how they were educated about their own culture and identity. People are doing work around racial identity development, and restorative circles and practices. And I'll talk more about the mentoring programs that we're looking at. And so part of our work is, when we say Maslow before we bloom, is how are we taking and making sure that the adults are handling their well-being to be better positioned, have the tools to, and emotionally ready, talking about emotional readiness, to be able to meet the needs of young people. Next slide. And then just being vigilant. And so knowing that this process of anti-racism is about self-reflection, which is at the heart of understanding trauma and well-being. And so we are not able to really unpack all that we have unless we engage in this. And, you know, this very specific and poignant, I think, message from Kendi, this idea that when a racist is charged with racism, they will typically say, I'm not a racist, no matter what they did, said or did, and an anti-racist will be willing to confess and recognize what they just said or did was in fact racist. And this idea that when we talk about how we get to racial healing, which is at the center of trauma and the post-traumatic stress that many students experience in real time over the last 5 years or historically, based on what they bring with them in terms of their family histories. That restorative conversations have to be a part of that. And so many of our schools are taking a restorative justice approach to the work as well. And I got my 2-minute mark, so I'm gonna speed up. Next slide. I'll skip past Bettina Love, but you'll have that available. Next slide. And so a part of the specific strategies that we've looked at, when we look at on the left, and I won't read it to you, but you'll see some of the things that are exacerbated by COVID and the inequities that were already there. We have a opportunity and achievement gaps policy. So there's already school committee policy on the books about focusing on inequity. And that's actually when I shared the racial equity planning tool earlier, that is actually where that came from. And so we borrowed it, I should say, from another urban school district, Seattle, actually public schools. But added onto it and made it aligned to our OAG policy, Opportunity and Achievement Gaps policy. And then I'll also sort of zero in on new strategies down here, number 1 under new strategies, is that we're looking at, given that we know that relationships, no true learning happens without a relationship. And the relationships are further strained by remote or hybrid, which we're starting remote and then going right into hybrid. We know that it's going to be hard for young people and teachers to build those relationships that are key to trauma-informed practices, to student well-being. And so we're looking at also launching something we call transformative mentoring that's taking the tenets of social emotional learning, culturally and linguistically sustaining practices, and best practices around mentoring and even online mentoring to try to ensure that we make sure we have other adults who have key touch points for young people throughout the school year. And so really excited to be here today to share this information and look forward to sharing more during the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Granson. Our next presenter is Pia Escudero, Executive Director in the Los Angeles Unified School District.
Good morning, colleagues. It's a pleasure to be amongst many of us who are doing this work of student well-being, parent and caregiver well-being, and staff well-being in this COVID-19 era that is definitely something that many of us have known to work with trauma, but also health disparities, and now in a pandemic, putting things into a whole different perspective. It was a pleasure for me to hear from Charles and the work they're doing in Boston, and also speaking to our colleagues in Seattle. I think that wherever we tend to focus on a conversation, we're all trying to figure things out, yet we've all known some of the needs and some of the disparities our children and our youth experience, but never to this point where it's universal. And it's also impacting us, the adults and educators and caregivers. So it is quite an undertaking. And I think opportunities like this and learning from each other and gathering strength to be inspired. As I start every week, this week I started counting the fact that we're starting our 25th week working from home in Los Angeles. 25 weeks, that's 6 months, and the duration, the tenacity that we all need, it takes a toll. So I think conversations like today are really important. If I can go to my next slide, I wanted to mention when it comes to trauma, I've been doing trauma work in Los Angeles for over 20 years, and we've known that our student population is exposed to trauma to varying degrees, but it's constant. Anytime we do screening, it's about 30% of our children witness community violence or have experienced someone being bullied, hit, kicked, and punched. As our children get older in middle school, that prevalence gets higher. And by 9th grade, we know that about 80 to 90% of our students have at least one traumatic event. When I started this work 20 years ago, it was something that our partners at UCLA and RAND said, those numbers are really high. They're higher than veterans. How can trauma be so prevalent in our children's lives? So we did screening. And again, those screening tools have allowed us to know that it has been persistent trauma exposure. And then when we talk to children, we realize economic uncertainties, the communities they live in have so many disparities. And this pandemic has really highlighted that. So I echo what Charles mentioned. Our district is 85% on free and reduced lunch, majority minority students of color. We have newcomers, we have children that are persistently in economic areas that are very challenging. And so what I wanted to highlight today is not just statistics and not just tell you, you know, that Los Angeles is not well, as our country is not well, right? We're just a representative, 600,000 students, 70,000 employees doing this work that takes so much strength. I wanted to bring to you this wonderful poster that I received from RAND. There's a quotation there, rand.org. They have had a program on resilience for more than a decade. And this COVID and all the racial injustice that we're experiencing brought the opportunity to bring this back and share with us adults. And our focus really has been working with adults to say that the road to resilience is not something that we have used before. When I started as a social worker in 1988, we were plan-based. We were focusing on short-term crisis intervention, focusing on center disaster, right, and risk focus. Things were narrowly defined, and we always wanted a matrix, a checkoff list, like how do we move forward? Today, we have to talk about what Charles also mentioned, that it is an asset-based approach, and really looking towards resilience that looks at relationship-based, generating community-based conversations and dialogues, and looking at long-term and using the strength of our community. It has to be sustainable, and it has to be adaptable to each culture. Los Angeles, the north of Los Angeles, looks very different than the south and the east and the west. And so we have to talk about not having a checklist, but really looking at each community with a sense of whole child. And so if anything, we've learned that our district has made investments in school-based health centers, in mental health services. But at this point, none of those investments have been good enough. So what does it look like to start looking at prevention and early intervention? So we start investing in children early. This year, we're launching a Primary Promise campaign where we really look at early education, our kindergartners, our first graders and second graders to adopt literacy skills. We're really going to look at this concept of focusing on staff as well as caregivers, but students' wellness and access to services. This roadmap really talks about honing in on the SEL practices so that every child feels safe on campus. When we return to campus, that the communities become really strong And if there's something unpredictable, as we're experiencing, and every night, every day, we have different stories. Last night, Los Angeles experienced also a death in our South Central community, and there's political and a lot of activity. And so we have to think about how do we prepare our students long term. I have to say that in my next slide, okay. So I wanted to bring forward this journal that I had a chance to read and really hone in on how to bring this dialogue into every school. And that is really focusing on resiliency factors. This concept about what do individual children need is a parallel process to what every family needs, every school needs, and community. Trying to make the conversation really simple for educators who are overwhelmed. I think we all have tremendous anxiety, and look at not having that checklist, as I mentioned, but how is each educator able to nurture and provide healthy relationships, and being able to really promote executive functioning and problem solving, hope and optimism in a virtual classroom. I say this because when we started school 2 weeks ago, the majority of the issues were Zoom disruptions. It was how do we engage children that are not engaged? And so we really have to look at this opportunity where we don't push children out of education system. One of the things that we've had a chance to work on this summer is looking at data to begin data dialogues. When we talk about oppression and we talk about racism, what does that mean? And what it means for us in Los Angeles is that our disproportionate number of special education students and students with disabilities, specifically emotionally disturbed students, are disproportionately number of African American and Latino students identified, including those that are in non-public schools, show that we have kind of funneled our children without early intervention and prevention, and really provide them with a lack of opportunities to develop those skills that they need. And we as adults are really burdened with putting those elements into the classroom, into education, and into our system. So I wanted to just highlight what we're working on in Los Angeles, which is really the opportunity to empower adults to know what regulation means and co-regulation means, so that they can really focus on engaging children who may be not engaging in learning today, or may not be able to provide the educational program that they need. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we're doing in Los Angeles is really trying to build this community in a virtual world. I wanted to mention that this was very challenging in March, April, and May. Our teachers, our social workers, our staff that was working virtually really felt that disconnect. So having a common language where we welcome every child to the learning opportunities that we have. Can you do the next slide, please? And having this conversation with educators, this is really interesting because when the pandemic began, we all said we don't have a playbook for this. Well, since March, we have so many playbooks, right? And we have a lot of conversations about instruction, how are we going to assess, how we're going to supervise, how we're going to implement instructional strategies, but we didn't really talk about SEL. It was sort of a side dish. So now what we've done, I just wanted to spend time on what the latest, what we've done in our Student Health and Human Services division is really making every educator familiar and embrace this opportunity to how do you build community? How do you create classroom expectations that are virtual? How do we provide check-ins and check-outs? And how do we hone in on using 4 connections over corrections? And that way our children are engaged in the educational process. What we've learned is that this has to be integrated in the educational opportunity. So to making sure that every child has an opportunity to learn in this virtual world. Next, please. So one of the things, it sounds really simple, but it's really been interesting to see. We have every day has a theme day. So today is Gratitude Day. So we have activities, whether we're in staff meetings, whether we're holding parenting classes, whether we're running a classroom, where we bring in these elements that are social emotional to learning, to instruction, and to really build a community that is supporting. And what's happening is we're able to really engage students, find out that children are have higher suicidal ideation and behavior, needing support. Students are able to request for mental health services, and so are parents. It's interesting, I haven't been an advocate before for telehealth and a lot of virtual services, but we have parenting classes today where 1,100 parents are engaged. We have dialogue days with students where students from across campuses can participate. And so really turning this opportunity where people feel disconnected and dysregulated. And I love this concept about Maslow before Bloom, providing those basics so that we can aim for our children to bloom. Next. Oh, that was it. So I just wanted to shift this conversation to say how we're going to have access to and provide services to our children, and making sure that we aren't able to necessarily affect school climate as we've known it and address the symptomatology of trauma as we know it, but how do we all become engaged in this road to resilience and participate and have part of the answer to all the issues that we're facing in schools today. So thank you. I realize I'm over time, so thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you. No, we appreciate your contributions very much. So next we have Dorothy Espelage from UNC.
Great, thank you very much. I'm honored to be part of this distinguished panel here. Also thrilled to see what is happening in Boston as well as LA Unified. I think they've already demonstrated how they're taking evidence and research and trying to do the work and improving that game book that Pia talked about. So thank you very much. And this should just really confirm some of the things that are happening in districts across the country. Next. So as we know, there's 1.6 billion children worldwide that have been impacted by the temporary, which seems almost permanent, school closures. And as we've heard from this group here, that our school districts play much more of a role in our families' lives and our students' lives, well beyond teaching math and science and reading. And so we are now realizing the inequities that have been exposed, blatantly exposed, has also shown some inequities in the ways in which we're addressing the well-being among children and their families, as well as the staff and teachers and administrators. Now, there's a great diversity in the ways in which the districts are rolling out. For example, my nephew, who's an 8th grader, went to school yesterday because he's not in a privileged situation such that his mom could homeschool him as a single mother. And when I debriefed with him yesterday, he said that it's not many people on the bus and none of his friends are coming back to school. They're all being homeschooled. So it'll be an ongoing conversation with him every day of how do you connect when your friends haven't chosen or had the opportunity to come and be with you at school. So that's just an example of how it hits home. It's different for many, many families, some that are privileged and have access to even the technology we're talking about. And so there's great diversity. Next. This just shows you some demonstrated. So I have nieces and nephews in the state of Florida, as well as South Carolina, where there is no option for homeschooling in some of those districts. There's mandated that they go back to school despite the fact that they might be coming home every day, compromising other family members. So it's great variability. It's not uniform. And so the approaches that we're talking about, much like you saw Boston versus LA versus say where my nephew is in Alachua County, where you have a governor that's ignoring many of the public health concerns associated with COVID, as well as the race relations that are playing out there. Next. So it's hard in some ways. There's some basic things like Pia talked about that, we just need to think about how do we connect with people that are being so traumatized. Prior to the pandemic, and 25 years of my work, we've struggled to get schools to even appreciate the importance of social emotional learning in some of our districts. I think it's very, very clear now that the families and students really do need to have this open line of communication to talk about the fears and anxieties about the virus and talk about how it is really a struggle for many families and students. We've done great work within the area of social emotional learning when implemented with fidelity from a research standpoint. And so we also have to recognize that what types of resources are being offered. So Pia talked about the 11,000 parents that are part of a network there and online. That's beautiful. I'm situated in the state of North Carolina where access is real, in that families are sitting outside of libraries trying to get their kids connected to schools, or they're what we call hotel families that are homeless trying to get connected because they want to understand the resources that they have available to them. So we have to give families and students agency to demand counseling, SEL programming, and think about how to pivot within the context of online learning. I think at the very basic level, we have to also model self-care, taking breaks and doing those things, the mindfulness that Pia was talking about as well. We also have to watch for changes in our kids, in the kids that we teach. We're doing it at the college level. We're very intuitive and thinking about the ways in which our students are connecting. So that's a K through 16 phenomenon, but it's also the families that we need to attend to. Next. When we think about those districts that have sent their kids back, and in some places this is a positive thing, it's the one place in which they can get connected, we have to continue to incorporate SEL and promote self-awareness and self-management and that regulation that we just spoke about. Understanding that, there's a physical distance as much as we talk about the 6 feet, there's also recognizing the psychological distance is taking a toll on all of us. We need to talk about, have open forms of communications and check-ins, and this idea of having a mindful Monday is beautiful. Reflecting on these social emotional learnings in developmentally appropriate ways. Also helping students and families to understand their own risk, their triggers, and how it is that they thrive in this pandemic situation. Also, if you're a parent out there, if you're teachers, how is it that you can incorporate some of these simple, mindful, evidence-based, research-based solutions without taking away time from the instruction? Even a few minutes check in and check out, we know from research really does has tremendous effects both in the classroom as well. We're showing some evidence online platforms as well. Next. So when many of the families are strictly online, there has to be, when you think about classroom management, which is an entire area that's evidence-based, here we have to pivot and say, what does classroom management look like when you're in a Zoom classroom management? You set expectations, you help students and parents outline their expectations for virtual learning. There is an assumption, I think, by some teachers in districts, a small percentage, that somehow everybody knows how to behave within a Zoom meeting, that everybody knows how to even manage Google Classrooms. And I think we're recognizing that there's a big dearth of skills that way. How do you facilitate social emotional learning in the context of online? Now, luckily, a lot of social emotional learning programs that are evidence-based have always had a technology component. It's just how do we then pivot to when there is no hybrid, there's no in-face connection. How do you maintain those social connections when we have all of the limits of being in a pandemic? And so you have to be creative, look at other examples. I'm going to provide you with a wealth of evidence-based links and things that people are doing, exemplars across the country. We really need to, as Pia said, understand how to motivate students within this context when in fact they might have had motivational challenges even to getting them to school. and the struggles that the families are having. So how do we make the work engaging and interesting? For many of us that are academics that are used to talking to people in large audiences, right? We're even struggling, and we're seasoned researchers, to say, how can I be more engaging when I'm doing these Zoom presentations? And so we have to really kind of own that. How do we then connect, which social emotional learning is always really efficacious if we connect it to what the kids and the families care about. Next. And so I've provided you with a number of online resources. There were, when we had the roundtable, we had Roger Weisberg join us from Castle. We had others join us. They got to work really fast. As Pia pointed out, RAND had taken their work that they had done for the last decade and then made it applicable in this context. So lots of things. You do not have to recreate the wheel. This is what people do with social emotional learning. They've always been an eye toward the evidence and the research. So I encourage you to check this out. Next. And so there's other comprehensive online SEL programs that I would encourage you to look at rethinked.com. Many of these lessons are free, and I encourage you to check that out. Castle has also moved to looking at the evaluation of these different types of online SEL programs. Next. And so even more research for you right here with Castle. So lots of blogs, people are talking about this. Folks that have been in the social emotional learning game for a long time have also really taken a lot of energy in the last 6 months to figure out what this looks like when we have families struggling with race relations and managing their daily lives. So thank you very much for having me. I appreciate this. This has been wonderful, and I look forward to hearing from Professor Worrell.
Thank you, Professor Espelage. Of course, these materials will be made available, so you all will be able to access the links and the resources that the panelists are providing. So next we have Professor Frank Worrell from Berkeley.
Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Stanton. Before I start, we've been sitting for 50 minutes, so why don't we just do a stretch? I mean, stand up if you need to, take a nice deep breath. Okay. All right, so thank you again. So when we think of schooling, learning, and education, we often think cognition, intellect. But at the heart of schooling is psychosocial, schooling is sociocultural. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind. So next slide, please. We have been talking about disparities and in fact who has been affected, and it's important to remember, again, even prior to the pandemic, that there are students who were in very different places. One of my graduate students has come up with this model, this idea of tailwinds and headwinds, right? That there are some students for whom there are tremendous tailwinds, right? They're doing very well, their families have lots of resources and so forth. They go to schools with lots of resources and highly effective teachers. But then there were also students who in fact were in very, very different circumstances. And then the pandemic came, and so what that did is it increased the headwinds, and in fact increased the headwinds sometimes for the students who had the most headwinds to begin with. So as we move forward in the new school year, it really is important to keep that in mind, that we need to identify the students who are most in need of our support, and that we need to identify the strengths of the ability. Next slide, please. So some of the losses due to COVID-19 that would have happened, in the social emotional space, feelings of security, right? The world is sort of turned upside down. Children had the routine of going to school, meeting their friends, there's recess, after school activities. That's no longer going on. Feelings of safety, right? So that in fact they have to worry about something that's unseen, that can affect them. Many of them have suffered losses. And then, of course, feelings of competence, not just academic competence, but the social competence that comes from engaging with each other in the classroom, learning to share and to take turns, playing in the yard, emotional competence, right? Behavioral competence. So all of these things have been losses due to COVID-19. And of course, there will be some potential behavioral indicators that you'll see in kids. Bedwetting, for example, being afraid to be left alone, increased anxieties and fears, anger, acting out and lashing out at siblings. So these are things teachers will see, these are things parents will see, and we need to recognize that these are coming from a different place. Is my child behaving a little bit differently, and what does that say about what I need to do? Next slide, please. So as we move into school, whether it's in person or online, one of the things that teachers need to do, I think this came from Scott Poland, who is a school psychologist who does a lot of work on crisis intervention, is get the student's COVID-19 story, right? What happened in the student's life from the time that schools were closed to the present? Can be a class assignment and so forth. Now schools need to plan, because you don't want every teacher doing this, right? You know, so you need to plan so that in fact some teachers are engaging with this assignment and sharing with others. And of course, this assignment needs to be developmentally appropriate. What you're going to be asking of a kindergartner is very different from what you're going to be asking of a 10th grader. But these assignments become vital information, not only for the teacher in working with the students, but also for the counselors, the social workers, the school psychologists, the parent liaisons and family liaisons that some schools have. Because this is all information that in fact will help us know who in fact are perhaps in greater need of services. Next slide. But in addition to the losses due to the pandemic, there are losses due to racial discrimination, as Charles mentioned, right? And these, yes, feelings of security, safety, and competence. We have several cities where there are violence taking place on the streets. We have had shootings. Even if children themselves are not watching the news, their parents are and are potentially talking about things in the household. Certainly for adolescents and older children, right, this sense of feelings of belonging, right? And the quote from the Clippers coach, "It's amazing why we keep loving this country and this country does not love us back," sums it up very, very potently. He said this with tears in his eyes, right? That if you are African-American in this country, and not just African-American, but Latinx and other groups that in fact have historically been marginalized, right? You are led to this identity conflict. Why should I care about school, right? As Langston Hughes said, America never was America to me. And so these issues also raise socio-emotional concerns for our kids in the midst of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So, you know, so we can think of then two sort of assaults on our social emotional competence. There's the personal identity support. Who am I? So am I motivated, confident, because I've lost all of that. I'm not in school anymore. My sense of agency and those kinds of things have been compromised. But my group, there's a loss and attack on the basis of your group identity. Does my group membership affect how society views and values me? And does my group membership then affect how I view myself? Because so personal and social identity are intimately tied together, and attacks on both of those require social emotional responses. They compromise our social emotional well-being. Next slide, please. And so in addition to the COVID-19 story that Scott Poland suggested, there's a racism story. In Louisiana and some of the states in the South, there's a hurricane story. Hurricane Laura just passed through. There's a fire story going on in California. And so there are multiple assaults that are taking place, and there are other things going on in some states that I'm not mentioning here. So these are things that we need to keep in mind, that we don't just have COVID-19. We have, in fact, a myriad of intersecting issues that are affecting students and their families. Next slide, please. So we can think of three broad groups of students, and this is, of course, simplifying it, right? But it's a way for us to get our heads around it. So three broad groups of students: those who are minimally affected, those with moderate levels of anxiety or stress, and students who are quite traumatized. Next slide, please. So when we think of the minimally affected students, right? So these are students who have been in households that have been, the parents are on salary jobs. They've not been affected. Their salaries have continued through the pandemic. There's been no impact on quality of meals, on quality of interaction with family. Their greatest concerns may have been loss of in-person interaction with peers. But many of these kids, they have tablets, they have cell phones. They have had ongoing access to their friends via the web because they have strong internet connections and not a strong sense of parental stress. This group of students, of course, if you think of as sort of a tier one, will be able to be supported by the teacher in the regular classroom and may not need additional work. Next slide. On the other hand, we're going to have a group of students who are going to be exhibiting serious signs of anxiety, right? They're worried about family members who are working inside of the house. They may have had family members, relatives who are not in the household who were or are ill. They are aware of the parents' worry about job security and income. They are concerned about the social racist injustice that's manifesting itself in the country. And these students will need sort of more individual and group supports from counselors, school psychologists, social workers, other people who have mental health expertise and who can help them work. And so that they'll need the work in the classroom with the teacher, of course, but they need this additional support from professionals. Next slide, please. And then we're going to have a group of students who are substantially traumatized. Extreme anxiety and stress. They may have lost family members to the virus. We know that people have lost jobs. In the news this morning, we have learned that in fact, for many renters, the moratorium on evictions is gone. So people are going to be losing their homes, their apartments. There may be food insecurity and so forth. And these students will need intense therapeutic support from school counselors, other mental health professionals, as well as wraparound services from schools to help deal with the broader needs. Next slide, please. So how do we sort of go about sort of then addressing this, right? So it's important for administrators and the administrative team at schools to identify and come to a meeting with the ancillary staff. You need to gather them, have a team approach, or almost as you do, in fact, exactly as you do in a crisis situation when there's been a hurricane or a suicide. You need to pull together this group as a team to develop a plan. Develop a plan for supporting the teachers in getting their COVID-19 and other stories. Develop a plan for reviewing those stories to help you identify which kids are in most of the need of support, and identify a plan for periodic screenings across the year. Again, whether in person or online, you need to be able to check in with students on a regular basis. Next slide, please. Right. Much of, at least from the school psychologist perspective, many school psychologists spend a lot of their time in testing. And some of that will still be going on. But we know that some of the testing that we do cannot be done because with masks, face shields, and those kinds of things, even if I'm in person, the test scores are not going to be valid. And so there's going to be time that school psychologists and other mental health workers have where they're not doing the traditional. And they can use that time, we can repurpose that time in schools to do more formal assessments of the kids who are showing up in the screenings as recognizing more support and providing supports to those children and their families. We also need to provide ongoing consultation to parents and teachers, right? Group sessions that are solution focused. Pia mentioned that, that they're having hundreds of people, actually parents participating in sessions because people need support and they want information, they want help. And mental health personnel can help co-teach SEL lessons alongside teachers in the classroom. So while we need to integrate SEL into the regular academics, there are also places where, in fact, it may make more sense to do separate lessons as well to address certain very specific things. And so mental health personnel can facilitate those as well. Next slide, please. We need to set up ongoing drop-in time and schedule sessions for targeted students, right? So we need to have regular sessions with them, but we also need to have times when students can just drop in because things are not going well. They're having a bad day, a bad moment, something has happened at home. For the schools that are online, there's a lot of asynchronous time in the day. And so those are times when students have work, but they're not in the classroom, not on Zoom. And those are times that in fact can be used for those drop-in kinds of moments, right? We also can supplement, because there's a tremendous need. We can supplement the social emotional personnel in schools by partnering with university programs. I spoke to the associate dean in our School of Social Welfare here, and they have 200 students who are not going out into schools, but who they need to provide field assignments for. And so these field assignments can take place via Zoom and stuff. So in fact, with effective supervision and recording interaction so that we have address concerns about liability, there are many university students who, in point of fact, can be of utility to schools and school districts. Next slide, please. So in closing, right, we know students need a number of things. And, so, and in this time, these are just some of them, but these are some of the big three. A sense of competence, as I said, emotional, behavioral, social, academic. So teaching, right, we know that in fact, social emotional well-being needs to be first, but actually a kid learning a new academic skill actually promotes self-efficacy, self-worth, self-concept. So actually doing effective teaching is assisting this problem, right? A sense of identity and belonging. Students need to feel that they matter, that their teachers care about them. We talk about culturally relevant pedagogy, and that's very important. But does my teacher, whether they're being culturally relevant or not, do I believe that that teacher cares for me? Do I believe that this school, that I matter in this school, that my group matters in this school and in this country? These are messages that students need to get. And hope, the idea of hope, it was on, I think, one of the slides that Pia had, right? Students need hope in their capacity to achieve as students, in their capacity to contribute as future citizens. All of these things contribute to this notion of resilience that Pia talked about. And when we think about it in the context of the United States, being anti-racism adds another layer, the sense of purpose, right? That I am actually going to be a contributing member of this society. And I'd really like to highlight one other thing. Fun Fridays were one of the things that was on Pia's slide. As parents, as teachers, as mental health professionals, we need to find times for students and adults, ourselves, to have a sense of fun. Yes, things are stressful, but laughter, as I think it was Reader's Digest used to say, laughter is one of the best medicines and stuff. We need to find time to continue to see the positives and the humor in life. Next slide, please. And so there are a few slides. These are just a few resources. APA, the American Psychological Association, the National Association of School Psychologists has resources. And this is the last one is a project from the 2019-2020 first year class at UC Berkeley. They put this together at the end of the semester. And with that, I'll turn you back over to Stanton. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Worrell. So thanks to all of our panelists. I would ask them all to come back and join us so that we could entertain questions that members of the audience might have. There are two ways that you could ask questions. There's a Q&A function down at the bottom of the screen there, and you can type in your questions there. I see we have one question so far. You can also, if you'd like to ask a live question verbally, then you can raise your little blue hand using the Zoom function, and we will pick up that question, and if we have time, we'll offer you an opportunity to ask your question live that way. I wanted to start by picking up on something that several of you mentioned in your presentations. This is a situation where young people are facing real challenges, economic, medical, mental health challenges, challenges with respect to racism and other dimensions of their lives, and they're facing various real injustices. And the tendency often for us when we respond to these things is to see what it is that's wrong with the students. You know, they lack this, or they're facing a challenge for that, or they're fragile in this way, or they're at risk in that way. And several of you said in your presentations, it's really important to take an asset-based, a positive approach. And so I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on how is it that we as educators can resist the temptation? It's a natural tendency, often not motivated by ill will, to focus on what's missing or what's broken or what's at risk, and instead take a more positive asset-based approach.
I can try to answer that because I had an interesting experience a few months ago. One of our, we were divided into 6 local districts. One of our local districts wanted to do a dialogue with students across high schools to talk about Black Lives Matter. And she came to me asking for technical assistance, and she and another colleague and I, we were very apprehensive. We're bringing children and students, youth from across districts. How are we going to de-escalate this? What was the purpose of this dialogue? How was she going to manage it if really opened up a lot of emotion, and then we turn off our cameras, and then what happens to these kids? And this leader just really planned it out well, and she really spoke to the students, and she convened an incredibly powerful panel of youth with the right parameters and support. And we adults learned from youth voice what they wanted, what was helpful, and they came up with things that we haven't. So if we continue this adult approach and speaking at the high level of what we think we need to do for our children without including children's voice, that is where we're missing the opportunity to do things differently, to learn differently. I have adult children. I'm very blessed. I have a tremendous empathy for those adults and colleagues that have young children, and they're raising children at home and working. So my adult children school me how here I am, a lifetime social worker, trauma and resilience informed, how I need to speak and how I need to reflect. And I think it's time for our youth to have these opportunities to speak. Yes, we adults have to prepare to be ready and to provide that support, but without having student voice, and we should probably have a student here this morning to be part of our panel. We adults are doing exactly what we've been doing to them instead of doing with them. So we have to bring caregivers and parents and even teachers. What I failed to say about the work that we're doing, because we really merged positive behavior support, SEL, trauma informed, all into this Monday through Friday theme, is that we have a Schoology. 8,000 teachers are feeding into that. So it's not us saying, here teachers, this is what you do for Mindful Monday, and this is what you do for Tuesday. They are doing and feeding it. And then we're asking, bring students work. Ask students, what would they do for Mindful Monday? And so everything has to be triple and quadruple track and layered, so that we're not forgetting to ask questions. Who else do we need? How else do we create that space where we really do this well for our students? They have tremendous strength, and we're not used to bringing them into the forefront, and we need to at this time.
Great, thank you.
If I would add, I would want to echo one of the things Pia said. I mean, for instance, even in the clinical space, if you are, in fact, working with a student, a child, asking them, what are you good at? What do you like to do? So getting a sense from them of what their assets and strengths are, so that as you continue the work, you can start from that place. And so that, so students will tell us, right, what they think they're good at, and in fact, and demonstrate, give us the place to work with them from.
Yeah, and I would add, Frank, for many of us that have been in that clinical space, often when we work with families and students, we think of those positive addictions, right? And we say, what makes you tick? And if you ask kids now what really makes them tick are the things that they don't have access to, right? So the peers, that connection, or sport, right? Like, think about sport. How many of us were resilient because of coaches in sport? And for many families, it's not there. So I think it is about, from my perspective, I think many of us have always been asset focused, but we're in a system even before the pandemic that is not, it's deficit focused, right? So here it's exposed, just our ideologies are coming to play now because we've all been forced to think about what makes us tick and what happens when you don't have access to those factors. Brilliant.
Charles, would you like to add on that topic, or should we move on?
Yeah, so many ideas. I was trying to collect them and organize them. And thanks to everyone. It was good to be able to go and then hear all the great thinking and ideas. We have a partnership with an organization called Open Opportunity Massachusetts that has worked across a number of different stakeholders that I don't need to go into in detail to name, but it gets back to something I saw on one of Frank's slides about how we partner with universities, but partners writ large around this work, because we just simply don't have the capacity. We didn't have the capacity before the pandemic, and really now we really don't have it. And sometimes even the expertise, right? And so a part of that framework, the initiative is called Campus Without Walls, is we're looking at, and this is under the leadership of many people, so not a BPS initiative, but external, looking at how we find the best teachers, the ones that were doing well and teaching well and meeting students' needs and doing what we call CLSP, cultural and linguistically sustaining practices, and who maybe need more support around online learning and those kinds of platforms, or who had one and maybe are just there in terms of the other. And how we bring them together provides sort of like a masterclass access across the board, across the system, beyond the boundaries of a traditional classroom, so that young people can have access to highest quality teachers. And then to have sort of like teaching assistants there to build the relationships with young people. And then to have a platform, a learning platform that's in terms of curriculum that is focused on liberated learning. And that this idea that we are constantly, as human beings, trying to get free from something. That has been our condition throughout modernity, right? And recognizes that in this iteration and in this context, it is systemic racism and all the other things that impact young people's lives. And how do we make them active participants in their project, in that project, and ensuring that we are in that way taking an asset-based approach. They are co-conspirators and co-constructors in trying to get to using education as a tool for liberation. And if there's anything in terms of assets and resources that historically marginalized people have, we know how to do that. And we're still doing it.
Great, thank you all. A second question. Many people have said that the pandemic, despite all the challenges, also creates opportunities. And so I wanted to ask you whether you think that what we're going through now can help schools rethink how they support the well-being of students. Are you optimistic that schools might be able to make well-being even more central to the work that they do? Have you seen examples of ways that people are seizing an opportunity or talking about seizing the opportunity to try to increase the focus on social and emotional learning and broader well-being of students? And what kinds of outcomes are you hoping for in that respect?
Well, as I mentioned in my brief comments, it's been a struggle for the last couple decades to get districts and teachers to see social emotional learning and well-being as not an add-on, that it's not something that happens Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock. And so for me, much like the appreciation of the teaching profession has changed, I think there is a realization that social emotional learning needs to be integrated, that it's not just something that you pull out on Tuesday morning and then you put back on the shelf. And so I'm optimistic about that. Did I want a COVID pandemic to be able to support the work that we've been trying to do? So I am in some ways, and I think that we've had to be much more creative about how to deliver this SEL programming in this context.
Yeah, I would add, I am hopeful, cautiously hopeful, that in fact, this is going to lead to positive outcomes in that regard. Let's take a fundamental thing of engagement. One of the things that in fact many schools discovered is that when the pandemic hit, there are kids who wanted to be there but could not be there. And so those kids who wanted to be there tried to find ways to be there. But there are kids who just didn't show up. They were not engaged. If, in point of fact, we do not, in fact, work with things like self-regulation and self-awareness and all of these social emotional factors, students will not become their best selves, academically or otherwise. And so therefore, if we do not, the teacher, right, is not just teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic. The teacher needs to be teaching fair play and persisting through failure and all of those kinds of social emotional skills. That's what makes for a whole human being. And so it really needs to be a part of school. And I think COVID-19 has pointed that out very, very clearly. And so therefore has given us the opportunity to rethink education with this as a key integral component of what every teacher and every adult in a school building should be engaging in.
I'd like to add, Dorothy and Frank, I think your comments were spot on in terms of this opportunity. It's almost thinking largely in a systems perspective. You can take the individual changes that are happening and the opportunities to address that in a whole different way that our systems never allowed us to do before, because we have a very rigid educational system that has been closed, that has done things the way we've done them, and yet academic achievement of all of our children has not been reflected in that system. So this has sort of ruptured those guardrails that we've set. And you mentioned the school building. The school building is a very rigid system. I think what is happening, looking at a large systems way, is really looking at how do we design an educational system that meets the needs of children. Here in LA, we have a lot of our chronically absent students in high school have jobs. They have child caring issues. And so how do we set up an educational system that is malleable to the needs of children, that they can have a job and then also probably have virtual schooling at night or something that is adaptable to the reality of our children? That's what we have to look at when we re-enter campuses, not to set up the same rigid systems and all the guardrails that we had. We're learning a lot. But more importantly, what I wanted to mention as a system is that school districts cannot do it alone. What we have done in LA is fed children and families and adults before our city did, before the county was able to do it. And we've been able to provide devices and internet to families. That should be something that much larger than a school district. We need our funds to educate and to provide services. The other thing that's happened, and we're in a large school, and I realize some of you are in urban and rural settings. We have partnered with Children's Hospital. Children's Hospital is in the heart, in the middle of, so I wonder about Boston as well, of our district, but you know, they're confined to their brick and mortar and their limitations. Now we're talking about how do we have telehealth in our school nurses, because there's a longitudinal issue. We know our children have health disparities and have health issues. We have tremendous issues with diabetes and asthma. And as we re-enter, what is going to happen to our fragile students? That school nurse, most of our schools don't have a full-time nurse, will need assistance, and we can't do it alone in the school. So how do we bring partners like Children's Hospital? We have RAND that is also assisting us. That's what, there's an opportunity to become an open system, to join in partnerships, to look at immediate, short-term and long-term needs. And without getting very political, the fact that there's such poverty and hunger in children in our nation today is not something that schools can address by ourselves. That is a systems issue of funding education fully where we need to do, so we are able to provide the services we need, educational programs that we need, but also have other entities come in and work with us in school systems so we address the tremendous needs our children have. So I wanted to take it to a larger, yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to quickly add to that, you know, I think I agree with what Pia shared in terms of a lot of what's changed is this rigidity. And for a long time where social emotional learning and work around cultural proficiency was knocking at the door on the outside looking in, it is now like, okay, we need these things and we need to learn them and we need to figure out how we do it. And then a step further is like, how do we co-construct with students? And so a lot of what is so powerful right now for us and that's innovative is things that we were doing in small pilots. We have 10 boys, 10 girls programs, work around rites of passage and developing, you know, self-esteem, self-confidence, all those self-competencies. And now those young people are leaders and some of them are older and they are like right there with teachers planning and co-constructing around like what learning should look like. And so it literally is all hands on deck, right? And so as many have said before, it's not that our students are and families are victims and damaged and, you know, just in pain, those things do exist, and many of them are, and at the same time actively participating in trying to create something new that doesn't go back to normal, actually, right? And so a part of our conversation in Boston Public Schools is what does a virtual learning academy or school or district look like? How do we make sure that we don't go back to normal? We want the virtual learning to be a component of what we do moving forward. And so we're like building that infrastructure into our central office right now to try to figure out what that looks like.
Great, thank you. We have 2 questions that have come in from the audience, and we have about 5 minutes left, so I'm hoping we can quickly, maybe one or another of you can address each of these. The first one is from Chian Sung, who writes, "There's often less attention to the needs and experiences of students in rural school districts than in other areas. What are your thoughts about the particular academic, mental, and behavioral health and other support needs of students in rural schools, and how these needs may be addressed?"
I'll just quickly chime in by saying that the thing that we have in common is the poverty. And also, and depending on where you look, you know, places like Arizona, the diversity and linguistic diversity. And so how do you oftentimes will find yourself in both settings, places where there are increasingly diverse assets, I'll say, instead of needs being brought to the table, and teachers may not be prepared to bring the best out of them and make the best out of them and meet the learning needs. And so teaching continues to, as it has over the last 15 years, radically shift in both of those spaces. What it means to be a teacher, folks who in our, you know, come out of our teacher prep programs locally, who I try to mentor as they get to more and more specific questions about teaching. As I get further away from the classroom, I just have to acknowledge it is just different. It is just different. And maybe we got smarter because maybe the students didn't radically change that much in the last 15 years. But as we get wiser and as the student population continues to change, both in rural and urban environments, how a teacher is prepared and what they're equipped to do is increasingly important given the context of poverty in both environments.
Great, thank you. One more question came in from Ariel Bierbaum, who writes, "To what extent are districts partnering with non-school district organizations to meet SEL and other basic needs like meals, clothes, etc.? How would the panelists like to see non-school stakeholders engaged with students, families, and school leaders to help meet these needs?" I know Pia just gave an example about Children's Hospital in LA, but perhaps you all have another example or two about this, working with non-district entities.
Yeah, so in the state of North Carolina, so mostly our schools are rural. So to add to the last question, you know, we're concerned about technology access, but we're also the essential workers are out there in factories working too. So that's a whole nother issue. They're largely English as a second language. So there's those challenges. We at North Carolina have partnered with Salvation Army as well as other nonprofits to get the basic needs met. We're to the point where we're feeding families and children and providing them devices, but now we're at the point where we need to provide more educational resources for these essential workers that have to go back to work and may not have access to even basic books or educational tools. So that's one example in the state of North Carolina.
There have also been a number of school-university partnerships. So for instance, UC San Diego is involved in several schools in the San Diego Unified School District. It was the first sort of, you know, so university assist schools, and these are not the traditional schools of children of academics. These are actually schools serving low-income and minority populations and so forth. UCLA actually has some involvement in some schools in that area. UC Berkeley has California Prep, Cal Prep. So there are a number of places around the country where there have been these partnerships so that in fact, Our students work at Cal Prep. My doctoral students work at Cal Prep, do their practicums and stuff there. So there's this kind of synergy between higher ed and K-12.
Great. Well, thank you all. We're down to the last minute or two. Any last words from folks, or should we turn it back to Amy?
I just want to say thank you for being allowing me to be a part of this and to think, so thoughtfully with you all about how we make sure we leverage all that needs to be leveraged in terms of social emotional learning and student wellness during these times. So, thank you.
Well, Charles said it better than I would have. So thank you all. And thank you all who joined us in the audience to listen to this. We think it's really important to be sharing this information. We've put together a summary report based on the roundtable conversation that Stanton mentioned at the beginning. And if you go to our website, which is listed here, you'll be able to find it. And again, thank you all so much for participating, and thank you to the panelists.